The Arameans, or Arameans, were an ancient Northwest Semitic Aramaic-speaking tribal confederacy who emerged from the Syrian desert in the Late Bronze Age and occupied the region known as Aram from the 11th–8th centuries BC. They established a patchwork of independent Aramaic kingdoms in the Levant and seized large tracts of Mesopotamia. The Western Aramaic language of the Arameans has been in steady decline in the face of Arabic since the Arab Islamic conquest of the 7th century AD, and the last vestige in and around Maalula is in danger of extinction. Although Aramean personal and family names and identity are still found among the Syriac Christians in the Levant, the Arameans never had a unified nation. They were divided into small independent kingdoms across parts of the Near East, particularly in what is now Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, the northwestern Arabian Peninsula and south-central Turkey. The political influence was confined to a number of states such as Aram, Damascus and the party Aramean Syro-Hittite states, which were entirely absorbed into the Neo-Babylonian Empire by the 9th century BC. In the New Babylonian or Chaldean Empire, Chaldeans, Arameans, and Babylonians became largely indistinguishable. By contrast, Imperial Aramaic came to be the lingua franca of the entire Near East and Asia Minor when introduced as the official language of the vast Neo-Assyrian Empire by Tiglath-Pileser III in the mid-8th century BC. This empire stretched from Cyprus and the East Mediterranean in the west to Persia and Elam in the east, and from Armenia and the Caucasus in the north to Egypt and Arabia in the south. This version of Aramaic later developed in Mesopotamia into the literary languages such as Syriac and Mandaic. History. Origins. The toponym Aramu appears in an inscription at the East Semitic-speaking kingdom of Ebla listing geographical names, and the term Arami, which is the Eblate term for nearby Idlib, occurs frequently in the Ebla tablets. One of the annals of Naram Sinavakad mentions that he captured double the Ensiv Arami in the course of a campaign against Cimaram in the northern mountains. Other early references to a place or people of Aram have appeared at the archives of Mari and at Ugarit. However, there is no historical, archaeological or linguistic evidence that the Aramu, Arama or Arame were actually Arameans or related to them, and the earliest undisputed historical attestation of Arameans as a people appears much later, in the inscriptions of Tiglath-Pileser I. Nomadic pastoralists have long played a prominent role in the history and economy of the Middle East, but the numbers seem to vary according to climatic conditions and the force of neighboring states inducing permanent settlement. The period of the Late Bronze Age seems to have coincided with increasing aridity, which weakened neighboring states and induced transhumance pastoralists to spend longer and longer periods with their flocks. Urban settlements in the Levant diminished in size, until eventually fully nomadic pastoralist lifestyles came to dominate much of the region. These highly mobile, competitive tribesmen with the sudden raids continually threatened long-distance trade and interfered with the collection of taxes and tribute. The people who had long been the prominent population within what is today Syria were the Amorites, a Canaanite-speaking group of Semites who had appeared during the 25th century BC, destroying the hitherto dominant East Semitic-speaking state of Ebla, founding the powerful state of Mari in the Levant, and during the 19th century BC founding Babylonia in southern Mesopotamia. However, they seem to have been displaced or wholly absorbed by the appearance of a people called the Alamu by the 13th century BC. Disappearing from history, Alamu appears to be a generic term for a new wave of Semitic wanderers and nomads of varying origins who appeared during the 13th century BC across the Near East, Arabian Peninsula, Asia Minor and Egypt. The presence of the Alamu is attested during the Middle Assyrian Empire, which already ruled many of the lands in which the Almas arose. In the Babylonian city of Nippur and even at Dilmun, Shalmaneser I is recorded as having defeated Shatawara, king of the Mitanni, and his Hittite and Alamu mercenaries. In the following century, the Alamu cut the road from Babylon to Hattusis, and to Kalti-Ninurta I conquered Mari, Anigalbat and Rapakam on the Euphrates, and the mountain of the Alamu, apparently the region of Jebel Bishri in northern Syria. The Arameans would appear to be one part of the larger generic Alamu group rather than synonymous with the Alamu. Bronze Age collapse. The emergence of the Arameans occurred during the Bronze Age collapse, which saw great upheavals and mass movements of peoples across the Middle East, Asia Minor, the Caucasus, East Mediterranean, North Africa, ancient Iran, ancient Greece and Balkans, leading to the genesis of new peoples and polities across these regions. The first certain reference to the Arameans appears in an inscription of Tiglath-Pileser I, which refers to subjugating the Alamu Arameans. Shortly after, the Alamu rapidly disappear from Assyrian annals, to be replaced by the Arameans. This indicates that the Aramaeans had risen to dominance amongst the nomads. However, it is possible that the two peoples had nothing in common, but operated in the same area. By the late 12th century BC, the Arameans were firmly established in Syria. However, they were conquered by the Middle Assyrian Empire, as had been the Amorites and Alamu before them. The Middle Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the Near East and Asia Minor since the first half of the 14th century BC, began to shrink rapidly after the death of Ashur-bel-Kala, its last great ruler, in 1056 BC, and the Assyrian withdrawal allowed the Arameans and others to gain independence and take firm control of what was then Ebenari during the late 11th century BC. It is from this point that the region was called Aramea. Some of the major Aramean-speaking kingdoms included Aram, Damascus, Hamath, Bitadini, Bitbahiani, Bithadaib, Aram Bet-Rehob, Aram Soba, Bitsamani, Bithalup and Aram Marka, as well as the Aramean tribal polities of the Gambulu, Littles and Pukidu. Later biblical sources tell us that Saul, David and Solomon fought against the small Aramean kingdoms ranged across the northern frontier of Israel. Aram Soba in the Beqa, Aram Bet-Rehob and Aram Marka around Mount Hermon, Geshur in the Hauran, and Aram Damascus. An Aramean king's account dating at least 2 centuries later, the Tel Dan Stele, was discovered in northern Israel, and is famous for being perhaps the earliest non-Israelite extra-biblical historical reference to the Israelite royal dynasty, the House of David. In the early 11th century BC, much of Israel came under Aramean rule for 8 years according to the biblical book of Judges, until Othniel defeated the forces led by Chushan-Rishathaim, the king of Aram-Napharaim. Further north, the Arameans gained possession of Neo-Hittite Hamath on the Orontes and were soon to become strong enough to dissociate with the Indo-European speaking Neo-Hittite states. During the 11th and the 10th centuries BC, the Arameans conquered Samal, also known as Yaudi, the region from Arpad to Aleppo, which they renamed Bit-Agushi, until Barsip, which became the chief town of Bitadini, also known as Beth Eden. North of Samal was the Aramean state of Bit-Gabari, which was sandwiched between the Syro-Hittite states of Karchemish, Gergum, Katina, Unchi and the Georgian state of Tabal. At the same time, Arameans moved to the east of the Euphrates, where they settled in such numbers that, for a time, the whole region became known as Aram-Napharaim or Aram of the Two Rivers. Eastern Aramean tribes spread into Babylonia, and an Aramean usurper was crowned king of Babylon under the name of Adad-apel-Iddin. One of their earliest semi-independent kingdoms in southern Mesopotamia was Bit-Bahiani Tel Halaf. Neo-Assyrian Empire, 911–605 BC. Assyrian Annals from the end of the Middle Assyrian Empire c. 1050 BC and the rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in 911 BC contain numerous descriptions of battles between Arameans and the Assyrian army. The Assyrians would launch repeated raids into Aramea, Babylonia, ancient Iran, Elam, Asia Minor, and even as far as the Mediterranean, in order to keep its trade routes open. The Aramean kingdoms, like much of the Near East and Asia Minor, were subjugated by the Neo-Assyrian Empire, beginning with the reign of Adad-nirari II in 911 BC, who cleared Arameans and other tribal peoples from the borders of Assyria, and began to expand in all directions. This process was continued by Ashurnasirpal II, and his son Shalmaneser III, who between them destroyed many of the small Aramean tribes, and conquered the whole of Aramea for the Assyrians. In 732 BC Aram Damascus Phelan was conquered by the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III. The Assyrians named their Aramean colonies Ebonari, whilst still using the term Aramean to describe many of its peoples. The Assyrians conducted forced deportations of hundreds of thousands Arameans into both Assyria and Babylonia. These Arameans were absorbed into the indigenous populations of Assyria and Babylonia and disappeared as distinct ethnicities. Conversely, the Eastern Aramaic language was adopted as the lingua franca of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 8th century BC, and the native Assyrians and Babylonians began to make a gradual language shift to distinctly Mesopotamian and Eastern Aramaic dialects and still survives to this day amongst the indigenous Assyrian Christians and Mandaeans of northern Iraq, southeast Turkey, northeast Syria and northwest Iran. The Neo-Assyrian Empire descended into a bitter series of brutal internal civil wars from 626 BC, weakening it greatly. This allowed a coalition of many its former subject peoples, the Babylonians, Chaldeans, Medes, Persians, Parthians, Scythians and Cimmerians, to attack Assyria in 616 BC, sacking Nineveh in 612 BC, and finally defeating it between 605 and 599 BC. During the war against Assyria, hordes of horse-borne Scythian and Cimmerian marauders ravaged through Aramea and all the way into Egypt. Aramea Ebonari was then ruled by the succeeding Neo-Babylonian Empire, initially headed by a short-lived Chaldean dynasty. The Aramean regions became a battleground between the Babylonians and the Egyptian 26th dynasty, which had been installed by the Assyrians as vassals after they had conquered Egypt, ejected the previous Nubian dynasty and destroyed the Kushite Empire. The Egyptians, having entered the region in a belated attempt to aid the former Assyrian masters, fought the Babylonians in the region for decades before being finally vanquished. The Babylonians remained masters of the Aramean lands only until 539 BC, when the Persian Achaemenid Empire overthrew Nabonidus, the Assyrian-born last king of Babylon, who had himself previously overthrown the Chaldean dynasty in 556 BC. Classic era. The Arameans were later conquered by the Achaemenid Empire. However, little changed from the Assyrian period, as the Persians, seeing themselves as successors to the Assyrians and having spent 3 centuries under Assyrian rule, maintained Imperial Aramaic as the state language, together with Assyrian administrative structures, and the name Ebonari still applied to the region. However, during the Greek Seleucid Empire, when the Greeks conquered Assyria from the Achaemenids, they applied the 9th century BC Indo-European name for Assyria to that land, which reads Syria, a derivative of Ashurayu, which had hitherto only referred historically and geographically to Assyria and the Assyrians, a land and people in modern terms situated in the northern half of Iraq, northeastern Syria, southeastern Turkey and the northwestern fringe of Iran, and not to the Levant or its largely Aramean populace. For the late 4th or early 3rd century BC, the Seleucid Greeks also applied this name to Aram, Ebonari, to the west of Assyria, Syria, which had been an Assyrian colony for 3 centuries. This caused both the Assyrians from Assyria and the Arameans to the west in Aram to be labeled Syrians in Greco-Roman culture. Despite the two peoples being geographically, historically and ethnically distinct from one another, this confusion would continue in the Western world until modern times, with the Syria versus Assyria naming controversy. The Parthian, Roman and Byzantine empires followed, with the Aramean lands becoming the front line initially between the Parthian and Roman empires, and then between the Sassanid and Byzantine empires. There was also a brief period of Armenian rule during the Roman period. Between the 1st and 4th centuries AD, the Arameans began to adopt Christianity in place of the polytheist Aramean religion, and the Levant became an important center of Syriac Christianity, along with Assyria to the east, from where the Syriac language and Syriac script emerged. Syriac Christianity survives among the indigenous pre-Arab population to the present day. Arameans continued to be the majority population in the homeland until well after the Arab Islamic conquest of the mid-7th century AD. A number of Aramean kingdoms sprang up in the region, the most important being Palmyra. There was probably some synthesis with pre-Islamic Arab migrants in the southern deserts. Middle Ages. After the Arab Islamic conquest of the region in the 7th century AD, native Arameans gradually became a minority in the homelands. The language was gradually replaced by Arabic as ever-increasing numbers of Arabs began to move into the region. Modern times Syriac Orthodox Christians in the Middle East today identify as Arabs in the Homs area, and as Arameans or Assyrians if descending from Abdon. A minority of Syriacs still speak various Aramaic dialects. In 2014, Israel recognized the Aramean minority, an Arabic and Aramaic-speaking Christian community. Language. Arameans are mostly defined by the use of the West Semitic Old Aramaic language, first written using the Phoenician alphabet, over time modified to a specifically Aramaic alphabet. As early as the 8th century BC, the Aramaic language competed with the East Semitic Akkadian language and script in Assyria and Babylonia, and thereafter it spread throughout the Near East in various dialects. By around 800 BC, Aramaic had become the lingua franca of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, although marginalized by Greek in the Hellenistic period. Aramaic in its varying dialects remained unchallenged as the common language of all Semitic peoples of the region until the Arab Islamic conquest of Mesopotamia in the 7th century AD, after which it was gradually superseded by Arabic, the late Old Aramaic language of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Neo-Babylonian Empire and Achaemenid Persian Empire developed into the Middle Aramaic Syriac language of Persian Assyria, which would become the liturgical language of Syriac Christianity. The descendant dialects of this branch of Mesopotamian Aramaic still survive as the spoken and written language of to this day, and is found mostly in northern Iraq, northwestern Iran, southeast Turkey and northeast Syria, and to a lesser degree in migrant communities in Armenia, Georgia, southern Russia, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan and Azerbaijan, as well as in diaspora communities in the West, particularly the United States, Canada, Great Britain and Sweden. as well as in Australia and Germany. The Western Aramaic dialect of the Arameans themselves is now only spoken by Syriac Aramean Christians in Maalula, Jabadan and Bakar. Mandaic is spoken by up to 75,000 speakers of the ethnically Mesopotamian Gnostic Mandan sect, mainly in Iraq and Iran. A small number of Israeli Jews, particularly those originating from Iraq, and to a lesser degree from Iran and eastern Turkey, retain Aramaic as a spoken tongue. However, this is largely being eroded by Hebrew, especially within the Israeli-born generations. Religion and art. It appears from their inscriptions as well as from the names that Arameans worshipped Assyro-Babylonian gods such as Hadad, Sin, Ishtar, Shamash, Tammuz, Bel and Nergal, and Canaanite Phoenician deities such as the storm god El, the supreme deity of Canaan, in addition to Anat and others. The Arameans who lived outside the homelands apparently followed the traditions of the country where they settled. The king of Damascus, for instance, employed Phoenician sculptors and ivory carvers. In Tel Halaf Guzanat, the palace of Kapara, an Arameans ruler, was decorated with orthostats and with statues that display a mixture of Mesopotamian, Hittite, and Hurran influences. Bibliography.